Aerial pictures of the compound in northern Syria where the leader of ISIS died show the devastation of the U.S. attack that ended his life. There's almost nothing left after the American bombardment and the ground attack as special forces stormed his hideout. U.S. President Donald Trump says Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi died like a coward, blowing himself up with a suicide vest and killing 3 of his children in the process. Trump says the world is now a safer place, but there is worry about revenge attacks from the terrorist leader's ardent followers. Our senior Washington editor, Lindsay Duncombe, has more on those concerns.
This is a huge blow for ISIS. You know, one of the ways in which Baghdadi was so powerful was his ability to recruit people to the cause. And at the time of his death, he was reportedly both in charge of the overall strategic direction, but also in terms of the on-the-ground tactics and planning as ISIS goes from having territory, which has been defeated and taken away from the group, to being more of a collection of fighters in sleeper cells. So it certainly is a blow to that organization, but it does not mean that the fight has gone away, because those fighters still exist in Iraq and Syria. Many people who study the region believe that there could be a succession plan in place. And as you mentioned, the fact that this happened could lay the groundwork for retaliatory attacks that could happen from those sleeper cells. So people who have a really direct and tragic experience with this group, including the mother of James Foley, whose son was kidnapped and executed by ISIS, have a message to the United States and to the countries that want to take advantage of this situation in terms of the ISIS retreat. Here's what she has to say.
It came as such a welcome surprise, really, that I was so grateful we had troops still in Syria who were able to use the intelligence and make this happen. I'm very, very grateful. I'm hopeful that his demise will be a huge blow to the regrouping of ISIS. However, we need to continue to be very vigilant, because they certainly want to regroup and bring back their reign of terror.
So Donald Trump has said that finding al-Baghdadi was his administration's top priority. So now that that is mission accomplished, how do you think that's going to change the fight against ISIS going forward?
Well, that's where there's some concern from people who watch foreign policy in the region very closely. The worry that now that Donald Trump has been president while Baghdadi was killed, that he will say sort of job over and move on. The real concern is being able to figure out how the group is evolving. And you heard there from James Foley's mother the ability of having troops in the region who were able to execute this mission. And of course, Donald Trump has taken out most of the American troops in Syria, which has shifted the power dynamic in the region to Russia and Assad. So even if you take a look at all of the information, the intelligence that was gleaned from the raid on the Baghdadi compound, if you don't have necessarily troops or intelligence in the region, how do you act on that? And that is one of the concerns as we go forward, because a lot of this comes from the intelligence community itself. And if you look at the dynamic in Washington and the long-standing dynamic with this president and the intelligence agencies, there is that rift there. And Donald Trump has been wary of the deep state. And there is concern that as this organization shifts, grows, mutates with this power vacuum, that the United States will not have the kind of eyes and ears on the ground in Syria to allow them to understand what's going on and potentially act in terms of stopping some danger.
For more on where this leaves the Islamic State and the threat it still poses, we've reached Richard Barrett in Dorset, England. He's a former director of global counter-terrorism at MI6, the Foreign Intelligence Service of the UK. He also coordinated the UN al-Qaeda Taliban monitoring team from 2004 to 2013, and he is now the director of the Global Strategy Network. So now, Richard, of course, we're following this story very closely. A lot of people are speculating about the possibility of retaliation against the West. From your perspective, how likely is that?
Well, it's quite possible, indeed. I mean, there'll be many people who are supporters of al-Baghdadi and the Islamic State who feel highly aggrieved at his death and want to have some revenge. But just as after the death of bin Laden, I doubt that there'll be any sort of major spectacular which has been in the planning and on the books awaiting for this eventuality.
Well, this is what I'm curious about. Is there a successor in place? Do we know at this point whether ISIS is organized to that extent that they would have been prepared for the death of al-Baghdadi?
Yes, I think there are two factors there. First of all, Baghdadi wouldn't have wanted any second in command to be too much of a threat to his own authority, so he wouldn't have necessarily promoted anybody to be an effective deputy. But on the other hand, there are several names out there of people who could take over. There's a Saudi, for example, and a Tunisian, as well as an Iraqi. One of them was killed quite recently, in fact, just the day after al-Baghdadi was killed, so we understand. And the others are probably under some threat too. But the key thing here is that although there may be somebody who could take over the organization, there probably isn't anybody who could take over the mantle of caliph, of claiming that descent from the Prophet and everything that Baghdadi claimed, to give him some sort of credibility and legitimacy as the leader of the Islamic State.
So how likely is it, do you think, that there will be any impact at all? I mean, I'm curious, you know, some people are saying, well, because the leader is gone, it does not really change the philosophy of ISIS or perhaps even their activities. What do you think? Is anything different today?
Well, I think there is something different, yeah, because this is a major loss for the Islamic State, certainly, to lose their leader like this. And also it shows the degree of penetration. Despite his obsession with security, he was found and killed. But I think the main difference is that the organization will carry on as an insurgent group, as a terrorist group, as an international terrorist group, but it won't carry on in that sort of sense of we had a caliphate, we controlled territory, and we want to get it back again. I think that's now highly unlikely that that will happen anytime soon.
Now, we're also hearing people talk about the situation that the U.S. now has withdrawn from Syria, that it doesn't have the sort of eyes and ears and intelligence operation on the ground that it had at one time. And I'm curious to hear what you think might that develop into. Is that a serious issue that the U.S. isn't there in the same numbers or the type of presence that it has been up until now?
Well, it's impressive that the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish forces, continue to cooperate with the Americans despite a sort of slap in the face of the American withdrawal and the permission pretty much given to Turkey to take over a key area of Syria. But whether they'll go on in the longer term, I think that remains in doubt. I mean, clearly the Kurds' main interest is in establishing their own authority and their own control of territory, despite the threats from the Syrian regime, the Turks and the Russians. Now, if America can be drawn back into helping them, maybe from the eastern oil fields in Syria, fine, you know, they'll probably continue to cooperate. But an organization like this one used to track Baghdadi required constant contact between the SDF, the American intelligence, between all the other assets that might have been there on the ground. And I think, obviously, if the Americans aren't there, it makes it much harder to maintain that network.
Now, of course, it's been years since bin Laden's death. But of course, I guess hearing this story of Baghdadi and the comparison of a leader of this type of a group, a lot of people are, thinking about the significance and how to compare the significance of Osama bin Laden's death in 2011 and now this latest death. How do you compare them?
Well, I see al-Qaeda still being relatively strong. It's got supporters all over the world, as has Islamic State. And I think Islamic State, when you look at its organization in West Africa, in Sinai, in Libya, in Afghanistan, this is not an organization which is going to collapse anytime soon, just as al-Qaeda didn't. Now, the key question is whether al-Qaeda and Islamic State supporters will begin to come together, because the main difference between them was between their leadership, between Ayman al-Zawahiri on the al-Qaeda side and between Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi on the Islamic State side. Now, without one of them there, and Zawahiri too is sort of disappearing a little bit, it may be that these two groups recombine, and that of course would mean a much more potent force out there in the field.
And just last question for you. What are you going to be watching for in the days to come? Presumably we're going to get more information. What will you be looking at?
Well, I think I'll be particularly looking to see the depth of penetration of the Islamic State networks, which led to this real disaster for Islamic State, and whether other senior leaders are rounded up or killed in the coming days. Because I think that if there's a real effort now to decapitate the Islamic State, it will have quite an impact. But on the other hand, I will also be looking at the franchises, as they're so-called, in other parts of the world to see if their attacks lessen or increase in any way because of this latest development.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. That was Richard Barrett, former director of global counter-terrorism at MI6. He is now director of the Global Strategy Network.